From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. This week, we'll be talking with Carl P. Borick, author of Backcountry Resistance, South Carolina's Militia and the Fight for American Independence.
As the title indicates, Carl's book focuses on rank-and-file militiamen of the backcountry and explores how these ordinary men were recruited, armed, fed, and motivated.
Drawing on underused pension records and state claims, he reconstructs their everyday realities and their battlefield experiences. He also examines the war's devastating effect on civilians, including enslaved people and women who played crucial roles in the struggle. Carl, it's great to have you today on the Journal. Let's talk a little bit about yourself. How did you get to Charleston as the director of the Charleston Museum?
Well, my background actually, Walter, is as an accountant, and I worked in accounting for 3 years before I went back and got a master's in history at the University of Alabama, and worked in accounting again, first in the Greenville area and then in Charleston. And the administrative officer job opened at the museum, and took that, and they quickly realized that I had more capability than just doing the books and doing HR and personnel. So I ultimately became assistant director, and then when my predecessor retired, I became director in 2013.
Okay, and when you took your master's degree in history at Alabama, was Dr. Pancake still there? Or?
Unfortunately, he had just left, but the room where the grad students met was known as the Pancake Room.
Yeah.
And his book, This Destructive War, is actually still one of my favorite books on the Revolutionary War.
Okay. All right. This is actually your third book on the Revolution, isn't it?
That is correct.
What were the first two books?
So first book is called A Gallant Defense, The Siege of Charleston, 1780, and deals with the British attempt against Charleston, which unfortunately ended in one of the largest defeats of the American Revolution for the Patriots. And then my second book is Relieve Us of This Burthen, American Prisoners of War in the Revolutionary South, 1780 to 1782, which was a bit of a sequel to A Gallant Defense because I was very interested in what happened to the prisoners of war that were captured at the Siege of Charleston, and then also men that were captured in the backcountry. And so the new book, Backcountry Resistance, is I would say a sequel actually to A Gallant Defense, and very much so, because I wanted to know how and why people like Marion and Sumter could continue to operate with the South Carolina government gone, and that's a good bit of what the new book deals with.
Well, one thing people don't realize about South Carolina and the Revolution is this was the only colony that was actually a government of occupation, which makes a big difference in how folks look at things.
Sure.
And you were in Charleston, and I have said this before, and this is what your book says. The war may have begun in terms of the revolution in Charleston and ended there, but it was won in the backcountry.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So why were these men in the backcountry who had no love for Charleston in the low country, why Charleston surrendered, people have gone on parole, take up the cause within weeks, literally, after the fall of Charleston? What motivated these men?
Well, I've got a whole chapter in the book on motivation, and one of the big, I think, motivators I see anyway, in terms of what the men reported years later in pension accounts and claims to the state, is that once the British move into the backcountry, they're organized as this loyalist militia. I think they're very much seen as invaders, and because there had been such strict oppression against the Loyalists in the 5 years leading up to 1780, there's a lot of retribution at hand by these men. And so one of the prime reasons that I saw, at least in my research, was it was too dangerous to stay at home, right? And so that's why a lot of the men are taking the field, because they're getting not necessarily cracked down by the British so much, but by their Loyalist neighbors who are out for revenge.
All right. This deserves a little bit more exploration, because you think, I leave home, wife and children are going to have to fend for themselves. But literally, and you have any number of examples of men who had been, you called them Whigs, and I think that was, of course, the correct term. They were on parole, they went home, but they were threatened by their neighbors more than their families were. Mm-hmm. And so really, That's why they flock to Sumter or to Bratton. And by the way, one of the things I really like is we all know the great triumvirate of our partisan leaders, Pickens, Sumter, and Marion. But, you've got Bratton, you've got Lacey, you've got people who had just a handful. But all across the upcountry, they begin to assemble. This isn't one great army, right?
Right. Well, and one of the things, as you saw in the book, the South Carolina government, it's eliminated basically at the fall of Charleston, right? John Rutledge is up in North Carolina, and he's not really able to do much. But it doesn't matter in the sense that the men that called out, these ordinary militiamen were the colonels and the captains and the majors of these militia regiments. So, men like William Bratton and Edward Lacey, they were the ones who normally got these men into the field, right? So the fact that they're still willing and able to resist is how, they send out a message into the community, we're going to assemble here, and that's how they raise these men. And they had been doing that for 5 years. I mean, as you well know, that everybody hears so much about the campaigns of 1780 and 1781. But, there was a campaign against the Cherokees in 1776 and 77. There's the expedition to Florida in 1778. There's threats by the British in 1779. So you've had repeated call-outs of militiamen in the last 4 or 5 years. So when 1780 rolls around, it's kind of rote, right? These men are used to being called out, and they know the drill.
Well, they know the drill, and the British occupation, or at least entry into the backcountry, is an example of how not to win the hearts and minds of the locals. I don't care who the commander is. It wasn't just Tarleton. They were all looking for blood, literally. Mm-hmm. And ironically, and I liked the way you dealt with this, Cornwallis basically wrung his hands about, they're telling bad stories about us.
Yes, right? And one of the other points I make in the book is, you're talking about a very oral society. I mean, you well know this. Most of the men who fight on, at least the enlisted men, are mostly illiterate, right? Word reaches down. It's word of mouth, and someone's horse getting stolen quickly turns into 5 horses getting stolen, and his house burned on top of it, and his wife threatened, and so once those stories start spreading. I think the British find very quickly that even their minor actions are going to get exaggerated, and that's also going to be a contributor to getting men into the field.
Yes, they might have get exaggerated, but there was a kernel of truth which started. Mm-hmm. And of course, the great one was the massacre at the Waxhaws. There was no denying that, but then it got grosser and bloodier as it was being told.
Sure. And a little more about that story at the Waxhaws, because it had to do with men who wanted quarter. Is that not right? And they did not receive it? How did that go?
So there's one Continental regiment left in South Carolina after the fall of Charleston, and they're on the retreat to North Carolina. And Banastre Tarleton, is going to catch up with them at Waxhaws and gives them the opportunity to surrender, which they don't take advantage of. One version of the story is that when Tarleton's horse was killed out from under him, his men thought had been killed, and Continental troops in the process of surrendering, and the Loyalist cavalry just rushes in and cuts down men in their attempts to surrender. So that's kind of a story is going to get. It's bad enough in its with the facts of it, but it's going to. In the retelling, it's going to get certainly worse.
Well, and you get Presbyterian clergy like William Martin, who preaches a famous sermon, and boy, does he really put it down. Cutting off arms, legs. Today, we go on the internet, but as you mentioned, an illiterate population for the most part, and you passed by word of mouth, and it was very easy. You might, at a crossroads, meet somebody. Did you hear what happened to the Waxhaws? Well, they go on up into Spartan District and they say, golly, hear what those Brits did. And it's very easy for a certain generation. You may have played a game called Gossip, and you started off, and how did it end? By the time it got through 8 to 10 people, it was an incredible story.
Right. The telephone game, right?
Yeah. Yes, but it was not just Cornwallis. Even his lieutenants like Crute, they were complaining about they're telling bad stories about us. And I think, as you did point out, there is a kernel of truth, because the behavior of the British Army of Occupation was about as stupid as it could be if you wanted to attract folks.
Right. Yeah, a perfect example of that. I tell a story in the book of James Cusack, who lived near Georgetown, and I believe it was James Weems is going to, burn his house down and hang him right in front of his wife and children. Yeah. That's documented, right? I mean, and so that becomes 50 James Cusacks eventually.
Well, and then of course you've got General Richardson's widow, who was mistreated, literally left with barely any clothes on after they burned her home, and the farm animals driven into the barn and door locked, and they burned them alive. It's just, it's almost unbelievable. I guess the Brits should be glad that they didn't have documentaries back in those days. Videos.
And the Richardson's widow story is an interesting one because, you think that's one of these things that comes from, Joseph Johnston or something like that in the 19th century. But that's written by Marion himself, that, what had happened at his plantation. And he's seeing that almost firsthand.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's interesting in terms of the backcountry where leaders are important. We've already talked about the militia leaders. The other leaders in communities were the clergy. And the Presbyterian clergy, it wasn't just William Martin, and there was Mr. Simpson. There were others who were very influential in leading their flock into revolution. On the other side, the potential Tories were a relatively weak group. The only prominent clergyman in the backcountry, Fair Forest Church, Philip Mulkey, was very definitely a Tory. He actually preached that everybody should be loyal to the crown, but his influence didn't go that far, other than people like Thomas Fletchell, who was a landowner in that area. But that was the largest Baptist organization in the backcountry. Fair Forest had about 8 to 10 small churches. So it's interesting that his influence was not greater. Right.
Yeah, and I think just the loyalist response in general is obviously very disappointing to the British. Cornwallis expresses it, his subordinates express it, and what I found interesting, Cornwallis is expressing it in September of 1780, just 4 or 5 months after the fall of Charleston, and I think. One of the points I always make, I make this in the book, I also make it in recent lectures I've been doing, is the Patriot/Whig government had really done a very good job of suppressing the Loyalists from 1775 on, right? People are, publicly flogged, people's estates are taxed so highly they have to sell them, people are exiled from the province. So I think the British were correct in that there was at least some Loyalists in the southern colonies. But when they get here, particularly in South Carolina, they've been so beaten down that they don't turn out in the numbers that they had anticipated.
But they do turn out, and they are vicious, those Tories.
Absolutely.
Burnfoot Brown and others.
Yep.
Torture. Of course, he was called Burnfoot Brown because he had been tortured by the Whig partisans. Hot tar applied to his feet. Not a very nice thing to have.
Sure. Yeah, it goes both ways, right? After the Battle of Kings Mountain, they sentenced, 24 men to be hanged, only hanged 9 of them. But you certainly have those kind of actions on both sides. And that goes back to my initial comment about motivation. It was so dangerous to be at home that you literally would leave your wife and family behind, your home behind, and you would, you wanted to make sure you were secure in a partisan or militia regiment.
Okay. And you had that, but you also had, I don't want to say revenge, but tit for tat reaction. Well, Huck, the Battle of Williamson's, a reaction to what he did, whether it was his profanity or burning Billy Hill's ironworks or what have you. There was the reaction to that, and the threat to hearth and home, because all these men wanted to do basically was. Particularly after the regulator movement of a decade earlier. And Alfred, we probably need to segue briefly into what the regulator movement was.
Go for it.
After the Cherokee War, the backcountry descended into a period of basically lawlessness. The terms we used, the riffraff on the rise, that was actually an 18th century term. And honest yeoman farmers were threatened, robbed, beaten. There was also a horse theft ring that stole horses in South Carolina and ran it back up the Great Wagon Road. Just like today, I-95, they steal a car in South Carolina and they hoist it up I-95 to New Jersey. And so the regulators were the decent sort who decided that those bad guys needed to be taken into hand. And so continue the story on that.
Yeah, and what's really amazing about that is the Commons House of Assembly was very slow to respond to the needs of the people in the backcountry. They threatened the regulators, and I think there's probably as much distrust of the South Carolina colonial government as there is for the colonial South Carolina government towards the royal government, right? Yeah. And they're the enemy. And what really I found fascinating that it's only 13 years later, right? I mean, 13 years is not a long time between kind of the heart of that regulator movement and 1780, 1781 South Carolina. And the fact that, a lot of these regulators who felt they had been mistreated were very much staunch patriots, as you know. So, but I think, there's a quote that I put in the book about one of the motivators. I think, there's frequent references to liberty and this idea of revolutionary ideals among, as you mentioned, pretty illiterate people. That, what is liberty? Well, it's, being able to rest under, a tree on one's own property and to be left in peace. And, in 1760s with the regulator movement, that's not happening. The other thing that I found fascinating was, and I think this comes from David Ramsey, shortly after the Revolutionary War, that a lot of these quote-unquote horse thieves are still around. And, you'll see a lot of references to Tories and horse thieves. So, these kind of banditti are still very active in 1780.
Well, and particularly in the Orangeburg area. Danger Thompson complained about them all the time. Now, back to the regulators. One of the ironies of the regulator movement to me was to have Charles Wood Mason be their spokesperson. Mm-hmm. He's someone whose diary has nothing but contempt for the people of the backcountry. But in almost perfect 18th century Whiggish terms, talks about the oppression, the rights, liberty. That's all through his petition that he presented to the Commons House. The first time he presented the petition, it was rejected because he was insulting the lawyers of Charleston. Mm-hmm. And legislators tended to be lawyers, a lot of them. So, but anyway, out of his petition, you begin to have courthouse towns. You have sheriffs. So these people, after the regulator movement is over, and it does take a while to clear it out, they just want to live in peace and farm the land or run that little crossroads store, whatever. And now that's threatened by the revolution, by the war, by the British and the Tories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think any colonial story, and not just the South Carolina colonial story, needs to read Charles Wood Mason. His journal is just wonderful. It just gives such an interesting snapshot, and obviously he's biased. He's got his kind of Anglican prejudices, but the kind of just description he gives us of what the backcountry was like in 1766 and 1767. And you're not, again, I go back to just over a decade, right? It could not have changed. For the common person in South Carolina, it could not have changed that much in that short period of time.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because usually when people think about colonial descriptions, they think of William Byrd's dividing line and his nasty descriptions of the North Carolinians. He could not hold a candle to Charles Wood Mason.
Sure.
Because Wood Mason actually lived there. Mm-hmm. I mean, having a sermon and 76 dogs or whatever it is being loosed into the congregation, and he labels them all Presbyterians. And
yes, yeah, and what's so fascinating about that, right? Because if you just read his journal and see the, as you mentioned, kind of the contempt he holds these people in, but on the other hand, he's the one who first wanted to stick up for them, right? Yep. They're his flock, and he looks out for them. And so, yeah, I absolutely love him. He just really, his descriptions are just amazing of what life would have been like in 1760s South Carolina.
Well, I want to digress from the actual war for one moment, because you came up with several interesting tables that I've never seen before. You assembled the list of loans made to the South Carolina government by women, which in itself, we need to delve into that some.
Absolutely.
First of all, the loans were made by women, which meant these women had control of that money. And we're not talking about insignificant funds. Now, it's not going to the militia, it's going to the state government, which early on is furnishing arms and ammunition, what have you, that the militia can have access to. But first of all, the records have been out there, but you found them and you made use of them. What led you there?
So I delved into the accounts audited for South Carolina, and so the accounts audited were claims that had been reviewed, and so they're called audited, after the Revolutionary War for folks that had, whether they had performed militia service or whether they had provided, X number of bushels of corn or wheat or rice, or made loans to the South Carolina government, which, not only were those women had done that, but numbers of men as well. So just in going through the accounts audited, looking for information on militiamen, I kept coming across these women, loaned, 1,000 pounds, loaned 10,000 pounds to the South Carolina government. And so I'm like, I've got to find a way to incorporate this because, and as you know, there's an entire chapter on civilians. Granted, it's a little earlier than 1780. It was 1779 and early 1780 where they made the loans. And once the South Carolina government is captured in mass pretty much after the fall of Charleston, they can't get those or process those loans anymore. And it is relevant in that sense because there's no funds left, right? So Marion and Sumter and Bratton and Hill and all the other gentlemen, they're on their own as far as trying to get supplies, right? There's no funding to do that. But those women and men had provided, significant funding to the South Carolina government from 1778 on into 1779 and 80, right up to the siege of Charleston.
Well, the other table is women who provided supplies to backcountry militia. And as simple as Ann Bono, 1 bushel of corn and 30 weight of pork. Another, Ann Craig, 3 beef cows and a steer. 1 cow, 2 beef cows, 2 bushels of corn. But they all had a receipt given to them, more likely by Marion and some of his folks. I'm not sure Mr. Sumter was too much in giving receipts. That brings up the other question of pay. These men were not being paid. They didn't ask for money. But if you were with Sumter, let's talk about Sumter's Law briefly.
Sure. Yeah, so let me just back up to the kind of summer and fall of 1780 before Sumter raises the state troops. The women that you mentioned are the way, and men to a certain extent who have remained at home, are the way that Marion and Sumter are feeding their men, right? They are just going to individual farms and families and saying, we need X number of cows or X number of steers and or whatever pork you have available, and handing them a receipt. And nobody knows what the outcome of the war is at that point. I think the Americans felt they were going to win, but who knows how long that's going to be, right? And so you're basically giving them a loan just like the women in Charleston had provided those loans. You don't know when or how you're going to get reimbursed. So Sumter, I think, really gets frustrated with the waxing and waning of his men in the spring of or late winter of into 1781. And that's when he's authorized to raise the state troops, right? And the idea was they would be given clothing, they would be given, pay, and they would be more well supplied than were his militiamen in the fall of 1780. And so this state troops that are formed is where the Sumter's Law comes from, that they would be paid using the booty that was captured from loyalists. And, men were promised an enslaved person that they, would be granted after the war. They would as I mentioned, the clothing and horses and those kind of things. So, yeah, that's going to create some chaos, right? Because it's oftentimes, I mean, as you well know, Walter, there's people that just wanted to sit it out, right? And they're could potentially be misidentified as loyalists. You certainly have enslaved people who are probably taken from both loyalists and people who wish to sit it out, and so it does create a lot of chaos among those folks who are remaining at home.
And Marion was very disdainful of that process.
Definitely. And you know what's funny about that is there's a letter from Sumter to Marion in the spring of 1781 where Sumter is kind of chastising Marion a little bit to make sure that his men don't plunder, where, the Sumter's law is essentially sanctioned plunder.
I want to get back to the concept of liberty, because in their pension requests, you find that mentioned time and time again. They talk about rights. They don't talk about the rights of Englishmen anymore, but they talk about right. They don't want to be deprived of their rights and their liberty. But this goes back to basically, leave me alone, folks.
That's correct. Yes, and that's why I love that you brought up Woodmason, because that's what Woodmason is saying in the late 1760s. They want parishes established and they want courts established, but they also they want to be left in peace. They don't want to be threatened by people coming to steal horses or insult their wives or their daughters. They want to be left in peace. And so, I think that concept, that's what liberty means to backcountry militia in 1780 and 1781.
Okay. Well, James Williams from 96 writes a very emotional letter to his son about why he is taking to the field. Here was a man who had already served in the Cherokee War. He was kind of old, but this is 1779. He's put the uniform on, and he writes to his I think it's his son this time, about to protect his rights and those of his children, the rights and liberties. And of course, James Williams would die at Kings Mountain, but he uses those phrases. And yes, he was a backcountryman. He was not illiterate, but what he writes is as eloquent as anything that came out of Thomas Jefferson and certainly out of Massachusetts.
Sure.
And he obviously was not alone.
Yeah, and I think, obviously, even in the late 1760s, you're starting to get, people in the backcountry, and James Williams would be a perfect example of that, who are starting to acquire some wealth. They're starting to acquire a good bit of land. They, a lot of them do own enslaved people, and those people are obviously learned, right? They're you're not going to be able to get that level of success without being able to read and write and be at least to a certain level cognizant of what the issues are with taxation by the crown and not being represented in Parliament. And those people, those colonels and majors and captains who are in these militia regiments, they're the ones who translate that right to their men. I think it was one man talked about in 1776 being under Andrew Williamson. They must have been fighting against the Creeks in Georgia, and a man comes into camp and he remembers the Declaration of Independence being read to them. And so, I do think that message is definitely translated by these learned men who lead in the backcountry.
Yeah, you mentioned that incident, but the commander basically called an assembly and had the Declaration of Independence read to his men.
Yes, and so those ideals are certainly being translated to the men, and not necessarily just in that instance, right? I mean, you mentioned the clergy that are certainly preaching in one way or another to these assembled militiamen at various times, and so they're hearing the message of liberty, whether it be from clergymen or from their own officers in their regiments.
Well, and again, going to the good Reverend Martin, very eloquently, besides talking about how dastardly the British are, he's reminding these Scots-Irishmen who've only been in the colony about 5 or 6 years, this is what happened to you back home. This is what the British stand for. They're evil people. And then it's time to fight. He said that talk is fine, but now is the time to fight. And people who witnessed that sermon a couple talks about listening to it, and the word of the Lord says, I must fight. So particularly with those who were Presbyterian pastors, when they put out the word, that was coming almost from on high.
Sure. Yes.
I mean, literally, it's not just your duty, it is an obligation, and God wills it. In fact, that's actually one of the descriptions of his sermon is, I'm going to do it because God wills it.
Sure. Yeah, and obviously faith is very important to these folks, despite the fact that Wood Mason, an Anglican, is so critical of these Presbyterian and Baptist ministers in the backcountry. It's faith that helps these folks live a very hard scrabble, life in the backcountry, right? And so, I mean, despite the fact that he's critical, I mean, I think he's at least cognizant that there's a very strong belief in God and that their Christian faith is very important to them. And, that goes back to what you mentioned with Huck at Williamson's plantation, because, according to William Hill, he was quoted as almost being blasphemous, right? And that's going to rile some people up.
Yeah. And I think it was to the effect of, even if Jesus Christ was a rebel, I'd punish him. To those folks, I mean, that really was blasphemy.
Yeah, and I think there's something to the fact that some of the men who fought at Williamson's plantation or were raised at that time were definitely provided some motivation for sure.
Well, and the outcome of Williamson's plantation, or Huck's defeat as it became known, there really weren't any prisoners.
Right, as in so many battles in the backcountry between Whigs and Loyalists. It was vicious. Look what happens after the Battle of Kings Mountain, where there's supposedly surrender flags are going up and the Patriots just keep on firing, and, men are executed afterwards. So it's a brutal war. I mean, the fact that people refer to it as, the South's first Civil War, there's no question about that. I mean, and, one of the other point I make in my book is, there may have been a Patriot militia who never even saw a British soldier during their time of service, right? But still were involved in a number of actions against the Loyalists. In fact, Thomas Swearingen, he's got a wonderful pension account, very detailed of his service. He served down along between the kind of Saluda and Savannah rivers. He talks about encountering a former playmate, he refers to him, who, after Swearingen was captured by the Loyalists, this gentleman loaded his musket without a ball, just put powder, and then put it at Swearingen's neck and fired at his neck, probably to scare him, one, but also would have burned the heck out of his neck with the flaming powder coming out of the barrel. And Swearingen, to his credit, says that that man later fell into his hands, and after some begging for mercy, he didn't kill him. So there's a lot of that kind of just ugliness in the backcountry for sure.
Well, how do you think folks today, when the world's a pretty vicious place, and too often the revolution has been portrayed as history behind a picket fence. Everybody's in blue coats or red coats and what have you, and it's a gentleman's war. I think that may be what Cornwallis hoped it would be, but it wasn't. One of the theories that has talked about why people joined was Clinton's famous proclamation after the fall of Charleston, and I think we need to touch on that.
Sure. So Clinton, after this great victory at the Siege of Charleston, is going to leave Cornwallis in command, and he's going to return to New York, their base at New York. But before he leaves, he issues a couple of proclamations. One essentially says that for those folks that do not declare their allegiance will be considered as rebels and enemies. And so he's not letting anybody sit on the fence. And honestly, if I think that proclamation has some impact on people deciding to fight, continue to fight. But as you pointed out, Walter, literally within weeks, right? I mean, before the end of May, within weeks of the fall of Charleston, you still have men that are starting to assemble or already have assembled and are willing to resist the British. So I do think that proclamation probably has some impact, But I think the fact that you are not letting people say, okay, I'm just going to wait and see how this plays out, you're kind of requiring them to make a decision as to whether they support the crown or whether they continue to be rebels, as he referred to them. Well, one thing that really struck me, and this actually, honestly, one of the things that inspired me to write the book is looking, if you look through Cornwallis's papers in the summer of 1780, it's, the theory has always been, okay, Patriots lose at Charleston, they lose 6,000 men. 3-4 months later, the Battle of Camden is a disaster. They lose another Continental Army. But what really just struck me is how many letters or how many references to both, by his subordinates and by him, where is Sumter? Sumter's close to Winnsboro or he's close to someplace, and he's got, 600, 800, 1,000 men with him. And there's this definite concern about how many people are being raised. And so, as I got into the book, it was kind of a more, at least for the Patriot side, more of a glass half full than glass half empty in the summer of 1780, just because there seems to be so many people who are willing to resist. And, Cornwallis is a good tactical commander. He is a terrible strategist. To go ahead and say, okay, we're going to move into North Carolina in September of 1780 without even having South Carolina pacified. And it just...
And then comes Kings Mountain.
I was about to say the same thing. Then comes Kings Mountain, right? And that, kind of turns everything around. And so, yeah, I think it's just amazing to me how much I think they obviously came in with some overconfidence. In fact, Clinton's, one of his famous quotes is, I think both Carolinas are conquered in Charlestown. So I think, and in his American Rebellion, he says, nothing remained except moving into the interior country and establishing, a series of posts and raising the loyalists. But that just doesn't play out, and they just did not anticipate what they were going to face. And
part of that was the British arrogance, which they displayed throughout the several hundred years of their empires. Is that the colonials they're rabble, they're not very smart, they're not fight, and they got their clock cleaned.
Yeah, and interestingly, because it's a different war in South Carolina, right? It's not, with the exception, of the Battle of Camden, is these, traditional linear formations, right? And Gates, unfortunately does use his militia in that way. And militia can't beat the British Army that way. They couldn't do it in the northern, in the battles in the north. They couldn't do it in the battles of the south. But when you get into South Carolina, when you're talking about mobility, when you're talking about a hit and run, when you're talking about, attacking loyalists as they're rising up, or they themselves are organizing and trying to march off to join the British. Yeah, I mean, in a traditional pitched 18th century battle, militia, both north or south, do not function well in that way. But they do if they're used in a certain unique way, like at the Battle of Cowpens, for instance, right? But they thrive. And even Patrick Ferguson even says it, that they're very good at coming up and basically taking these pot shots at British troops and then mounting their horses and riding off again.
Well, I've often said, because I did work with the Commandant General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth on about irregular warfare, and I said, look to South Carolina. I said, I think Mao Zedong, when his guidelines, he was riding behind Francis Marion.
Sure. I've had the good fortune in the last few years to have. You mentioned the Fort Leavenworth. I've had the good fortune to talk to a group of captains who come down from Fort Bragg, U.S. Army Special Forces, and Francis Marion's father of U.S. Army Special Forces. It's very difficult. One thing that we always discuss is very difficult for conventional forces who fight in a conventional manner to deal with forces who fight unconventionally. And the point I always make is that's true in 1960s Vietnam. It's true in 21st century Afghanistan and Iraq. And it's certainly true in 1780 South Carolina. And that's the point I always close with, is that warfare from South Carolina in 1780 and 81 is still very relevant today.
Well, in fact, there was a very early book on the pamphlet, actually, during the South Carolina Tricentennial about the Partisan War by a military historian who compared what was then a not yet full engagement in Vietnam with South Carolina.
Right. Russ Weigley's book, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. We did the same thing. The British created strong points, Camden and other places. But who controlled the territory between?
In between.
Especially at night. Who controlled the dark?
Right. Yeah, I mean, part of the problem with that system, at least for the British in South Carolina, is none of them are in supporting distance of one another. The closest would probably be Hanging Rock and Rocky Mount, and you might get mounted troops to support an attack on one or the other, but you're not going to get men who march to be able to support them that quickly. And ultimately, the northern part of South Carolina becomes a bit of a frontier for the British because they, around the Battle of Camden, they're going to evacuate those two posts anyway, and which had been threatened by Sumter. So you're right. You can have those strong fortifications and those strong posts, but you can't do anything about those multiple miles in between them.
Well, I've always loved Cornwallis's reply to a friend who asked after his trip into North Carolina, Guilford Courthouse, and afterwards, "Are you going back to South Carolina?" And he said, "No, I have had quite enough adventures there." And of course, he heads north with a badly beaten army to Yorktown.
Yeah, and Ian Saberton, who published the Cornwallis papers for the Southern campaigns, he really I referenced him in the book because he makes the point that he essentially just hung out to dry his remaining British soldiers and loyalists in South Carolina, right? He essentially just marches away, and Greene and Marion and Sumter and Lee are going to take care of them one by one.
Yeah. People forget that the war continued in South Carolina even after Yorktown. Just because Cornwallis had surrendered didn't mean it was over. Some of the last skirmishes in the Revolution were here in South Carolina because Charleston was not evacuated until 1783.
Right. Yeah, and, a Bloody Bill Cunningham, you referenced Burntfoot Brown earlier, but Bloody Bill Cunningham mounts a pretty successful raid into the interior of South Carolina in the second half of 1781, after Yorktown, after Cornwallis had fallen. And he inflicts a lot of damage on some Patriot militia and hangs Joseph Hayes at Hayes Station. It's kind of a last hurrah, but you continue as the British are eventually pushed to the coast. Andrew Pickens complains, I think, in September of 1782 that there's a bit of an uprising in Long Canes district, and so there's still a lot of fighting to be done after Yorktown for sure.
Well, where do you go from here? This is your third book on the Revolution in South Carolina. What's next on the agenda?
So if I could just talk a little bit about the Charleston Museum for a second, Walter. So for the 250th this year, we've got a wonderful exhibit at the museum. It's called Ringleaders of Rebellion, Charleston and Revolt 1775 to 1783. The title comes from when the British found out after the Battle of Camden that the paroled militia and civilian leaders in the Charleston area were continuing to correspond with people in the backcountry. And once they found out that they round them up and they exile them to St. Augustine. And Cornwallis refers to them, we have basically taken out of the province or refers to them as the ringleaders of rebellion in this province. So that's where our title comes from. But we've got some wonderful pieces on exhibit. Eliza Lucas Pinckney silk gown. Eliza Lucas Pinckney was obviously very important in bringing indigo to South Carolina, but she also was one of those women who made substantial loans to the South Carolina government. We've also got the first broadside of the Declaration of Independence that was printed in Charleston when news was reached in August of 1776. It was printed by Peter Timothy. And then for the first time in almost 250 years, the logbook of the HMS Bristol, which was Parker's flagship during the Battle of Sullivan's Island, is going to be on loan to us from the Royal Museums at Greenwich. So we're very excited to have that. So anyway, I would encourage people to come to the museum between now and September 20th to see that wonderful exhibit. As far as research, I've got so many ideas. So, as you know, there's a lot still to be talked about with the Revolutionary War in South Carolina. I would like to maybe do something on, Greene's return to South Carolina. John Buchanan's done a little bit on that. But those accounts audited don't just stop in 1780 and early 1781. They go on to, I served at the Siege of 96. I served against the Tories and the Backcountry in 1782. So I think there's more that can be researched, and so we'll see where my next research project is.
So our state archives, which is a wonderful resource, still is a treasure trove.
Kudos to my colleague and friend Eric Emerson, who's the director of the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. He's the one who got those accounts already digitized, and I would if you are interested in Revolutionary War history, I know a lot of genealogists have used these in the past, but there's really some great information on not only militiamen, but South Carolina Continental soldiers, but also large numbers of civilians who contributed to the war effort in those accounts audited files.
Okay, well, Alfred's giving us the wind-up sign. Any last words you might want to have for our listeners?
Again, I would encourage people not only for our exhibit to come visit the Charleston Museum. It's we're America's first museum, but this is just an exciting year for our state with the 250th anniversary. I think it's a really terrific opportunity to get people just kind of reinvigorated on our state's Revolutionary War history, which, as you well know, Walter, I do stand behind our claim on the new state license plate where the Revolutionary War was won. If you didn't have what happened with the Backcountry Resistance, if you didn't have this defeat at Kings Mountain of the Loyalists, if you didn't, and certainly didn't have the Battle of Cowpens, Cornwallis does not end up at Yorktown. And so I think we can honestly stand behind that statement.
Well, yes, and I think that's a wonderful note on which to close. Thank you so much for being with us today on The Journal. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Carl Borick. I know that I did. When Charleston fell in May of 1780 and the Continental Army retreated, many assumed the Patriot cause in the South had collapsed. However, as Carl shows us in his book Backcountry Resistance, partisan militias in the state's rugged interior waged a brutal insurgency that challenged British control and ultimately changed the course of the war.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
Many of the books discussed on Walter Edgar's Journal can be found as part of the Walter Edgar's Journal Book Nook section at all good books in Columbia, South Carolina, or may be available from your local bookstore. We'll talk again soon.